Let's talk about homemade sun cream and why is everybody lately declaring their love for rice?
We love you.
We're grateful for you, for everything that you do for us.
You're awesome.
We love you so much, Rice.
They're recreating an experiment from 26 years ago by Dr. Masaru Emoto. His book sold more than 3 million copies, so I'm not surprised this experiment is still around nowadays. What he did was he took 3 different jars of rice and he spoke to each jar each day. To one jar he said thank you, to the next he said you fool, and to the next he ignored it. And then after a month, the thanked jar he said was fermented and sweet smelling. The you fool jar was black and rotten, and the ignored jar was even worse. So he concluded from that we need to be really careful with our words and what we say to people.
Especially with regard to how we treat children. We should take care of them, give them attention, and converse with them. Indifference does the greatest harm.
Harrison wants to know if the rice experiment is legit or if it needs to be debunked. Well, with so many people already doing this experiment online, let's take a look at their results first.
They've all got yellow, and we've decided as well. They've all definitely had some sort of yellow decay.
Decayed, but
quite obviously, this one's had a different kind of reaction, which is exciting. And then the last one.
it's disgusting.
It's a little yellow, and the container marked hate it's in bad shape. Ignore it's in better shape than the container marked hate.
Basically white. The ones we ignore, you can see, starting to see some dark yellow mold. And I hate you rice. It's very nasty.
On like that side, not on this side. And then there's like that mass right there, but definitely the bad rice is the worst. And when I look inside the good rice, there's not really any like visible mold developing on the inside. It's really just this one spot.
This is pretty underwhelming for us as well.
There is definitely like a yellow happening here. It's like a darker, and then on the top, there's a big clump of black. Ignore has this like crazy red mold going. Oh, it almost looks like drops of blood in here.
If we look at all of their results side by side, then you can see that the results were actually really quite varied. Some had yellow bacteria, some had red, some had black mold, others had green mold, some were bubbling. It's completely different, which is what you'd expect because they all used completely different methods. Some of them kept the jars in the dark, other ones kept them on a shelf in the sun, some added water on top of the rice and others did not. But if we look at that top row there, overall the loved ones do seem to have fared better than the others. So are these results scientifically accurate or not? To find that out, we're going to run the experiment ourselves and put it on a time lapse. One of the issues, and I think the reason why everybody has different methodology, is this has never actually been published in a scientific journal, which should raise some red flags because there's a lot of boxes you have to tick in order for your study to be able to be published in a scientific journal. But the only reference we have to go from, because Dr. Emoto has already passed away, is different TV interviews that he did where he gave a description of the experiment. And in those TV interviews, the actual TV show then mocked up some B-roll of the experiment. One of them shows uncooked rice in open containers, and on a different program they used cooked rice, drowned it in water, and then added a lid. If we look back at the original experiment photos though, the jars are closed. It looks like it's cooked rice and I can't see lots of extra water in those jars. So I cooked the rice by the absorption method and then I sterilised the jars and spoons for scooping. Now this is a really important step because the moisture and starch from the rice will be providing a perfect environment for any tiny amounts of bacteria or mould spores that might have been on the jars or the spoons to multiply rapidly. Now, my concern is that with sterile jars and boiled rice, nothing is going to happen when I put this on time lapse and it will be really boring to watch. So I'm going to put some of them just like that, and with others I'm going to add contamination into the jar. I've taken swabs of mouldy looking things and added a slice of rotting beetroot, give that a good shake around, and now we just need to add 1 ml of that liquid into each of the jars so they're all equally contaminated. And we can see if speaking positively to the rice inhibits the growth of bacteria and mould. In each setup I have 2 contaminated jars, 2 clean jars, and 1 that is open just for fun. And if you listen in, these ones are being complimented on loop 24/7.
Better place. You're the most beautiful rice I've ever seen.
And these ones are being insulted on loop 24/7.
Rotten and mouldy is all you'll ever be. You're not even worth the container you're in.
I feel sorry for that rice. And the last set has nothing at all. It's got no sound, which normally when you do an experiment, that would be called the control group. But in this experiment, he's called that neglect. I've put a time lapse on for 3 whole weeks so we can see what happens to this rice. Let's start by looking at the hate group. Now remember, the open jar is not scientifically relevant. They're just for fun. It's like using an open petri dish for an experiment. They'll be contaminated by anything that lands in it from the air, and then the rice gives it a perfect environment for that to grow. I feel like I have to say don't eat any rice that's been left sitting out at room temperature like this. Even if you can't see anything wrong with it, bacteria multiplies quickly and it can produce toxins. And some of the bacteria on rice that produce dangerous toxins are white in colour, so you may not notice them. All right, let's take a look. Turn that off and put a lid on the open one, trying to contain all the mould spores if we can. Now this one, as I said, is not scientifically relevant, but it is still interesting. There's a greeny grey mould, some white mould, some yellow colour bacteria in there. There's plenty going on. Now let's look at the sealed ones. There is a little bit of a mark there, but not much visible. And the second jar is similar with just a little bit on the top here. Now these 2 jars surprise me. Obviously I didn't contaminate my water enough, either that or there was some bleach left on the surfaces that I swabbed, so I've killed anything that was in it, I'm not sure. But they look good, but again, not edible. Now let's compare that to the neglect ones, which were the ones that fared the worst in Dr. Emoto's experiment. Not much is happening so far, but let's give it time. The open one, again, not scientifically relevant, has a bit of black in it. And is that some black on the sealed jar next to it, or is it just a reflection? Oh, we'll have to take a closer look. The jar that was open was taken over by this white mould, and there is some of that greeny mould in the centre. The clean rice looks like it has some at the top, just a little bit there, and the second one looks pretty good. Having 2 jars helps reduce the effect of chance in the results. And the contaminated one has the tiniest of dots there, but pretty much same as the others. Before we take a look at the love jars, I've got a surprise for Dave. 20 years ago, when our eldest son was born, I made a family tree. The only problem was we had very little information on Dave's dad's side of the family. It's pretty much blank. I'm hoping that today's sponsor, MyHeritage, a platform where you can explore your family history, build your family tree and discover DNA connections, can help fill in some of those blanks. Let me enter the info I have, which is not much. Done. Are these the same person? Yes, that's definitely Dave's dad. Here are 50 people you can add to your tree. Wow! Look at that, it goes all the way back to 1780. These are your great-great-grandfathers. This is John Coyle.
Cool hat.
And this is Timothy Reardon. They both came to Australia on a convict ship and they were both convicts.
Oh, really? What did they do?
Both of them actually stole food during the Great Irish Famine, and most of the convicts on that ship had the same story.
Sheesh. That's rough.
I've got so much more interesting stuff that I found for you to read. Sign up for your 14-day free trial to enjoy all the amazing features that MyHeritage has to offer. Now let's check on the love jars. We've definitely got some sort of yellow bacteria in the open one that's taken over pretty early. One of the clean jars is starting to grow some mould. And to prevent any contamination at all, the rice jars would have to have been heated once they were already sealed. Here's the yellow one up close. Gross. The clean one has a bit of mould in there and a little more there. I advise that you don't open these jars if you do this experiment, but I am going to open them for the camera so you can see if there's any on top. The next one has a little bit there, but apart from that, it's pretty good. And the contaminated ones, again, look the best. I can't see anything growing in there, but do not eat this, of course. Now, I've arranged all of these with the worst side of the rice facing you. The bottom row is neglect, this middle one is hate, and the top one is love. So when using sterile jars, the rice experiment shows how you speak to rice has no effect. So what about all the experiments that we saw online before where love looked better? Well, sadly, only one of them sterilised their jars first.
So with the help of another subscriber, Eve, who's a grad student in experimental bioscience, we set up the experiment following her guidelines. Step 1, sterilize 3 jars to destroy any bacteria.
And they're the ones who had no mould growing in any of their jars. Dr. Emoto was actually offered $1 million if, under scientific conditions, he could repeat the experiment and get the same results. He didn't even respond to the offer, which I'm pretty sure if you knew you could repeat that in 30 days, that's an easy 1 million. Why wouldn't you take it up? As I've said in previous episodes, if someone is a doctor, you need to look up what they have a doctorate in. Don't just assume that they're a medical doctor. In this case, he had a doctorate of alternative medicine from the Open University for Alternative Medicine in India, which is a university that was shut down for handing out degrees in exchange for money without people having to do any relevant qualifications to get them. So definitely not ideal. And if you looked into it a bit more and actually watched a few more of his interviews, you might have started to question his qualifications for yourself.
What about, like, on packets of cigarettes? We have these words, like smoking kills. What would you like to say about that?
This is so bad, you know? It's, I think, designed for killing people. Not from cigarettes, but what itself has the energy of killing people.
Now, even though the rice experiment itself was bogus, I'm sure we can all agree that his message from that experiment, which was to watch what we're saying to others, is really important and is true. There have been plenty of studies on this, and most of them have been done by psychologists. There was one famous one that I'm thinking of where they followed married couples over 20 years and they were looking for anything that was a predictive factor as to whether they would stay together or break up. And they checked everything like finances and all different areas in their life, and there was one predictive factor that could predict with 95% accuracy who was going to stay together and who was not going to make it. And that was the number of positive interactions, things like being attentive when you're listening and being empathetic and being kind to each other, versus the number of negative interactions, so things like hostility and criticism and anger and blame towards the other person. And the ratio needed to be 20 positive to every 1 negative. So 20 positive interactions for 1 negative. That says that the negative can do a lot of damage. So we really do need to be very mindful and very careful what we're saying to other people, making sure it's something that's going to build them up and not tear them down. Next, Yelena wants to know if homemade sun cream is safe.
I've been making this homemade sunscreen for years. It's only 4 ingredients and super moisturizing. All you do is mix together olive oil, coconut oil, and beeswax in a mason jar and put it in a pot of water on the stove to melt. Once it's completely melted, turn off the stove and add in non-nano zinc powder. Make sure to stir it together really well so the zinc doesn't settle at the bottom. Then pour it into your container of choice and keep the jar moving or stir in between pours. I like these plastic-free tins I got on Amazon that come in various sizes. And you can always make some containers stronger SPF by simply adding more zinc.
Let's test it out. These first 3 ingredients will not give you any sun protection. They're just giving you a base creamy mixture. Once it's melted, the zinc oxide powder is quite hard to incorporate. It just wants to sink to the bottom. Lots and lots of whisking later, and it's finally well incorporated. Now on the website that this post linked to, it said if you add 2 more tablespoons of zinc oxide powder, you will get a higher SPF. So we're going to test that one out too. Now I've got a UV sensor which lets us see if the sun cream is absorbing UV. If it's absorbing the UV, it will look black on camera. So let's take a look at normal sun cream first. This one is just from the shops, and wow, that is very effective. Now if we go to the homemade sun cream using the recipe shown on the video, that looks like it's reflecting the UV but not absorbing any of it, which can still offer some protection by acting as a physical barrier. And as you'd expect, the one with more zinc oxide looks even whiter again. Now let me spread those out as you normally would do with sun cream. You don't just have a thick stripe of it. So this is the shop one and it's absorbing lots of UV. This one is reflecting a little and this one is reflecting more. To measure how much UV it's actually blocking, I'm going to put a small amount of each sun cream onto acetate and then spread it out over the rectangle. I'm using a different finger for each one so we don't mix them together, and then we can test that in the sun. I bought a UV meter for this, which measures UV in microwatts per centimetre squared, and if you use some calculations you can convert that into the UV index. Now I'm just not sure if the meter I've got is working 100% correctly, because yesterday the UV index was 11.6 here in Australia, which is on the extreme end, but the UV meter I've got is reading well over that. So we're not going to look at the actual number because I'm thinking it's inaccurate, but I'm hoping we can still use it to tell if the sunblock is working to decrease the UV that's getting through to the sensor or not. So let's start with the store-bought sun cream, which even though it's totally clear and you can't see it there, the UV reading drops down to 0. So the sun cream is absorbing all the UV and none of it is getting through to the sensor, which would give your skin full protection. Next, let's look at that fairly opaque coverage of the homemade one. It does drop the UV by reflecting some of that and providing a physical barrier between the sun's rays and the sensor. And if we go to the one with even more zinc oxide applied so thick that you can't even see the sensor through it, it of course brings the UV down to 0. So if you're happy to apply the homemade sun cream like this, then you'll be protected from the sun. The other problem I've found with this one though is if you even just slightly bump it, it comes off on your clothes and on everything else, leaving them white and leaving you with no sun protection. So don't use that homemade sun cream recipe. It is not going to protect you, and it's quite dangerous that they're saying that it will. So what about sun creams that you buy at the shop that say they have zinc oxide in them, like this one, which says it's a physical sun cream and it contains zinc oxide as the only active ingredient? If we look at that one with the UV camera, you can see that it is actually absorbing UV rays. It doesn't look as black as the other one did, and that's because it's also reflecting some too. Now the reason why this zinc oxide is absorbing UV when the homemade one was not has to do with the particle size. The particle size has to be really, really tiny in order for it to absorb the UV. Now there has been so much research that has gone into the products that you see on the shelf and so much testing to make sure that they are actually protecting you from the sun. It's just not worth risking trying to mix something up because you recognize one of the ingredients on the label and assume that you're going to get the same level of protection. But let's test this store-bought zinc oxide one out in the sun. And it's working perfectly. The UV is going down to 0. This sun cream does still have a slight white tinge to it from the zinc oxide. You can rub it in, but you can still see it a little bit there. If you don't like that, then the chemical-based sun creams are usually totally clear, so that would be a better option. Some people are sensitive to those though, and that's why there are these mineral-based alternatives for those people, so they've got something. The other option is you can just cover up and use a really broad hat and a UV protective jacket, but believe me, that is really hot on a hot day to be completely covered, but it is an option that does work. With thanks to my amazing patrons for all of your support of this channel. You guys are amazing and I really appreciate you. Make it a great week by being kind to others and speak some words that build them up, and I'll see you on Friday.